Hello and welcome to Opt Thrive, episode 18, The Secrets to a Mutually Satisfying Sex Life in Long-Term Relationships.
Welcome to Opt to Thrive, your go-to podcast for women's wellness in midlife, designed to educate, support, and inspire you to live your very best life. And now your host, Dr. Karina Sims.
Hello there. Wow, it's all happening around here. The figs have come into season. Hubby's full on doing the picking and spraying the grapes. We're getting ready for grape harvest as well in the next couple of months. And my son has gone off to Japan and my daughter's flitting around the world in her job. It's been pretty interesting. This is going to be an interesting Christmas for me. My children are both overseas, and so I will be childrenless. I guess this is the start of, how it goes, doesn't it? It's been scorching around here. We don't get much of that, nice 20 some odd degree weather. We just jump pretty much right into the hot stuff. It's 30s plus quite often. And yeah, summer is upon us. Luckily, I'm in a good stage of really loving my fruit. I think if you've been listening to me, you'll know that I've developed a taste for fruit that I've never had before since I've been really building all this muscle, making sure that I'm meeting my protein targets and my fiber targets. And it's just meant that I haven't had a lot of room for Snicker bars and cake and ice cream, etc., etc. Which is interesting. Christmas is coming up. I do plan to indulge around Christmas, having all the things. One of my favorite things is Christmas fruit mince pies. And so I got some of those the other day. I've been enjoying an occasional mince pie. I love the pastry. It's amazing. So today, again, I just think I'm loving what I'm doing because every time I sit here in front of the microphone and do a podcast episode, I'm really excited about the topic. I think that means I'm doing what I'm meant to be doing. I have been seeing a lot more women with libido issues recently. By libido, I mean sex drive or desire to have sex. And it's had me reflecting. Now that I'm doing these regular menopause clinics, I've been able to carve out, significant time for these appointments. And look, we're just making that happen. The clinic has been super supportive in accommodating these clinics because you know what? There is no Medicare item number for this. And I really hope that there are some female policymakers out there listening because I am so hopeful that the recommendations from the recent inquiry in the Senate into perimenopause and menopause will be acted on. And there will be, in the future, such things as special perimenopause, menopause management item numbers, because it'll make it more attractive for other clinics to offer this service too. So anyway, I'm asking these questions. We have a lot more time to talk about things and really kind of dive into the issues that are affecting women at this stage of their life. And this is a big one. So we're having more conversations and it's been really good. In the past, I haven't been able to offer these women a lot in terms of treatment because, like I've been harping on before, this is an area that has not been done justice by the research dollar. And treatment outcomes have been pretty dismal up until now. Now, I'll also admit that I could have known more about it too. But you know what? As a GP, we have to know a little bit about pretty much everything. And as a rural GP with limited access to services, we have to know that much more because a lot of us run emergency rooms, deliver babies, resuscitate babies, do surgical procedures, or anesthetize people as part of our daily work. So as well as keeping up to date on all of the usual stuff, there's only so much time in the day. We can't know everything about everything. Most of us have a special area of interest or two or three that we tend to spend what extra time we do have learning more about. And so I'm very often reading and updating my knowledge, and lately, because of all of these libido conversations I'm having, I've been doing more reading around women's sexual health. One of the statistics that I came across while doing this reading made me a little bit sad and a lot motivated to do more talking about what I'm finding on this platform. Now, that statistic was that in women over 50 in particular, only 25% of them have ever discussed sexual issues with their doctor. 25%. I think a lot of women feel awkward not only discussing sexual issues with their doctor, but often also with their partners. So as I've been reflecting, I can see there's a whole lot more room to expand on the previous episode that I did. Let's talk about sex. And let me tell y'all, as the only consistent female GP in my little town for many years, paired with my work as a GP obstetrician delivering babies, I was a default go-to for what we used to call in GP land tears and smears. That's a little outdated now because we don't do pap smears anymore. We do cervical screening tests. Maybe I'll do an episode on that at some point. Between all the smears and the baby delivering and repairing the effects on a vagina of those babies being delivered, I have seen a lot of vaginas and vulvas, cervixes, and uteri, whatever the plural is. And I have counseled countless women and couples on sexually transmitted infections, fertility issues, painful intercourse. I have seen and treated thousands of atrophic vaginas. That's what happens when our poor vaginas lose their estrogen around menopause and they try to shrivel up. I did not think there was much more I could learn in this area, but let me tell you, I was wrong. I have been down in some rabbit holes and I have learned some things. I can't wait to share them with you. Crazy amazing stuff about how our bodies work, about the differences between men and women, their thoughts on libido and what affects a woman's libido in particular. Boys, man, they really are on a different planet sometimes. And I'm sure that they would say the same for us too. We're going to talk about what happens to a woman's libido throughout the life cycle. Spoiler alert. Actually, if you're listening to this, you already know the news isn't so great. Well, I take that back. Some of y'all are pretty happy never having sex again, so it doesn't really matter, but you might be really interested in what is going on. And because you're here listening to me, I suspect you will be. We're going to talk about things that we can do and stop doing to help with libido. And then I'm going to give you the skinny on testosterone therapy. And I might even share what my own experience has been with testosterone. So, when the subject of libido comes up with my patients, if there is an issue, it generally falls into a few main categories. The woman has lost her desire for sex and couldn't care less if she ever has sex again, but her partner is quite disgruntled and is causing issues in the relationship. Or the partner's understanding and she's feeling guilty about it. Or the woman is distressed herself because she misses her sex drive. One statistic I found was that up to half of us women between the ages of 20 and 59 at one time or another has been affected by a low libido. So here's the skinny. This is what's happening. It is normal for sexual interest to fluctuate throughout our lives, especially around reproductive changes, because they cause hormonal shifts. Our libido can decrease during pregnancy, after giving birth, when we're breastfeeding, and then again in all of those years of perimenopause leading up to that final period, menopause. There are also many other things that can affect a woman's libido. Fatigue. Lots of things can cause fatigue. So sleep deprivation, poor sleep, depression, thyroid disorders, diabetes, being anemic, not getting enough exercise, not managing your stress. And look, I really can't help myself here. If it's good for you, it's good for your libido. Exercise. All right. Mood. So being depressed, anxious, or angry. If you've got pain in your body or vaginal pain, Obesity. Did you know that people who suffer from obesity are 25 times more likely to be dissatisfied with sex than those who are not overweight? Not being happy with your physical appearance can affect your libido, not being attracted to your partner, and especially underlying relationship issues. They can seriously affect your libido. If there's been a history of assault or childhood interference, negative family or religious views, all of those things can affect a woman's libido. Now, a lot of these same things may not affect a man in the same way, and that's because he has the benefit of testosterone. Men have 10 to 20 times more testosterone than we do. For many men, not all, which we're going to discuss further later, his desire is most often just under the surface, and he often only needs to see the curve of a breast or a bit of thigh, and his desire is stirring, and it might not take a whole lot to be off to the races. Our lower testosterone levels mean that our desire is more easily overridden by all of the life things going on. He can have a big, long, busy day, and he's ready for a little roll in the hay before heading off to sleep. If we've had the same long, busy day, chances are the only thing we want to roll in is our comfortable pajamas and a down doona. So there's that, and then there's a few other things. Now, a lot of the information that I'm going to talk about today is coming from a book that was recommended on the Jean Hale's website. It was there that I was listening to a talk about libido. Now, if you haven't heard of it, Jean Hale's is a fabulous resource. Jean Hale's was actually an Australian GP who started the first ever menopause clinic in 1971. Can you believe that? What a visionary. An absolute legend. I do find it a little troubling that it's taken us this long to get to the point that we are only really starting to have these conversations more openly, more frequently. But never mind, here we are. We're making it happen. Anyway, I digress. So I was drawn to this talk on the Jean Hale's website because of the involvement of Professor Susan Davies, who was one of the founders of the Jean Hale's organization. Dr. Davies is an endocrinologist, so a hormone specialist, and she is a globally respected expert in sex hormones in women, but she's especially renowned for her work around testosterone therapy and advocating for its use in something called hyposexual desire disorder. I would go so far as to say she is the reason we in Australia are leading the way in testosterone therapy with the only TGA-approved topical testosterone made specifically for women. I'll be talking more about that a bit later too. So one of the resources listed as part of this talk was a book by Dr. Rosie King. Now, I was familiar with Dr. King's work, as in I'd heard of her, but I hadn't actually read any of her books. But because this was a resource, I headed down that rabbit hole. Dr. King is a well-known, very experienced Australian sex therapist who has been practicing in her capacity as a sex therapist for over 3 decades. And before that, woman after my own heart, she spent 10 years in general practice. So off I went, diving into this book. Where did my libido go? Well, I pretty much read it in a day. Far out. What a great book. Now, for a bit of context, the night before reading this book, I had gone down a different rabbit hole, which led me to reading about the mechanisms of female orgasm, as you do. And that led me to the story of Maria Bonaparte. Yes, I hear you asking. Maria was related to Napoleon. She was his great-grandniece. So Maria was a psychoanalyst who actually worked with Sigmund Freud. And Maria had an issue. She had an issue of not being able to experience an orgasm through sexual intercourse. She was only able to reach climax with clitoral stimulation alone. Now, she hypothesized that her clitoris was too far away from the vaginal opening to achieve stimulation during intercourse. And that's why she couldn't climax with vaginal intercourse. So she helped not only develop, but also underwent a surgical procedure known as the Halban-Narjani procedure. I am sure that I butchered that. I have no idea how to say that. But this procedure is where the clitoris is surgically repositioned to be closer to the introitus, or the opening of the vagina. So in theory, it can be stimulated during intercourse and result in orgasm. Now, Maria had her procedure in 1927. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But Maria wasn't a quitter. She had another 2 attempts at this procedure. Apparently, old Sigmund told her not to do it, but she did it anyway. Sadly, apparently, she was never able to achieve a vaginal orgasm. She does get an A for effort, though. Anyway, again, I digress. The point of the story was, while hubby was watching the cricket, I was reading this amazing story, which I couldn't help but share, right? Now, that conversation led to another discussion, a discussion around libido. That discussion then ended in a tense discussion, as it usually does, as we have our differences on the subject. But then, the next day, I stumbled on and then consumed this book by Dr. Rosie King, and wowzer, I learned a lot of things. So that night, again, while hubby was watching the cricket, man, how many days does a cricket go for anyway? I shared this new information. This discussion was so much different than the night before. This discussion was profound. We were able to have such a beautiful conversation where we probably, for the first time ever, actually felt like we really understood each other around this issue. So my hope is that the information we get into today can help lots of other couples out there too. Not just heterosexual couples either. These issues can affect all relationships. Okay, so I want to start with something called the desire discrepancy. And I also want to talk about the limerence effect. Let's just start, though, with what is a normal libido? I want you to listen up close here, because contrary to what mainstream media says it is, a normal libido is the one you've got, period. Some of us have a lot of desire, and some of us have not so much. It could be a high libido or a low libido, but both are normal. Libido is what we call fluid. It fluctuates over time, and it's impacted by all those things that I mentioned before. So the take home here is that normal is subjective, meaning it's in the eye of the beholder. And this is where a huge part of the problem comes in when there is a problem with libido. When 2 people in a relationship have 2 different levels of desire or 2 different levels of libido, this is called a desire discrepancy. Now, before we talk any more about desire discrepancy, I want to explain something called the limerence effect. This was first documented in the 70s by a psychologist named Dorothy Tenov, and Dr. Rosie King breaks it down in her book. Essentially, limerence is all of those intoxicating feelings you have when you're first in a relationship. Remember those? It was a time most likely when you couldn't quite get enough of each other. You were infatuated. Now, from the woman's point of view during this time, there's likely lots of romance, there's not a lot of conflict, and she's probably getting lots of affection. And all of these things can be real libido boosters for women. So then she's probably very sexually responsive, and he's probably getting frequent, passionate sex. Everybody's happy for now. Now, limerence doesn't happen to everyone, but for those that it does happen to, it usually lasts for 12 to 18 months, but it can last up to 3 years, and then the woman's libido starts to decline. It is natural and normal for a woman's libido to decrease over time in a long-term relationship, and especially if there are things like pregnancy, breastfeeding, children, sleep deprivation, relationship, financial, or work-related stress. But when limerence has worn off, there is then, most often, a desire discrepancy. And often, He thinks he's been bamboozled and that something has gone wrong with her. And the messages that mainstream media promote perpetuates this opinion. So he thinks something's wrong with her and blames her and thinks she needs to be fixed. She might also think something's wrong with him. I have this conversation a lot in my office. And or thinks he just wants too much sex, and so she blames him. His desire causes him to actively pursue having sex, and when she's not interested, this can lead to a toxic cycle in the relationship called the pursuer-distancer cycle. He can become more and more frustrated and use different tactics to try to get her to have sex, like pressuring her, coercion, demanding, being unreasonable, nagging, sulking, complaining, humiliation, making cracks in front of other people about how much sex he's not getting, emotional blackmail, giving the cold shoulder, not talking to her for days when she turns him down. But sadly, for both of them, really, the more negative tactics he uses, the further away she gets from wanting to engage in sex. So she distances herself. She may stop undressing in front of him. She may stop touching him in case he gets the wrong idea. She might go to bed at a different time. She might pretend to be sleeping. She might claim to have frequent headaches, whatever. She just finds ways to avoid being in a position of having sex. And then the more distance she creates, the more he pursues, and this vicious cycle is perpetuated. The reality is that they are both craving intimacy and affection, but nobody's getting it. Now, if we could just rewind back to the time period when the desire discrepancy was first being noticed, and if they both knew that this was completely normal, that nothing has gone wrong, that desire discrepancy has been a phenomenon in long-term relationships for as long as we've existed, maybe the toxic pursuer-distancer cycle could be avoided. But what do we do if we're stuck in that cycle now? I think the answer is a pattern interrupt. I think, number one, knowing that the desire discrepancy exists and that it's normal, we can stop blaming each other and we can look at what is really happening here. So what is happening? Well, men often use sex to create intimacy. They often equate sex with love. Sex is often how they get their emotional needs met. When they aren't getting sex, they can feel unloved, rejected, and hurt. Now, women are usually much better at getting their emotional needs met in lots of other ways with different people, friends, or family. And where men often use sex to create intimacy, women can need intimacy to ignite their desire to have sex. The solution, then, is to communicate, negotiate, and compromise. It's a team effort. It is a relationship problem. He's not to blame, she's not to blame. It's about finding a way to make both partners happy. And there are lots of things that can be done. There are lots of things that work towards and work against a woman's libido. And now that we've set that scene, I'm going to stop there and we're going to dive into the second half of the secrets to a mutually satisfying sex life in long-term relationships in the next episode. I hope that this has brought more understanding to some of you out there. I'm hoping that maybe sharing this with your partner can be helpful if this is an issue that you're going through. In my experience, through my work, I know a lot of you are really suffering with this problem. I decided to do this talk and then doing this research last night, and then I woke up this morning and went on my Facebook. I belong to a couple of groups on Facebook to do with menopause, perimenopause, midlife women. And the very first post that I saw this morning was a woman with teary face emojis saying that her partner, after 10 years, had left her because of her low libido. It happens. Unfortunately, I don't think that people understand that the limerence effect can happen in an extramarital relationship. And then if you were to pursue that relationship long term, the same exact thing is very likely to happen because it's a natural, normal phenomenon. So I'm hoping that what we talk about here can be very helpful for some relationships out there. I'm going to ask you all to share this episode with others. I'm going to ask you to rate and review the podcast so that it can be made visible for other people who could really get a lot out of this information. I hope you have a great week. And until next week, I hope you opt to thrive.
The Opt to Thrive podcast is designed for information purposes only and is not engaged in the giving of medical advice. The information provided on the podcast should not be used for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease. In no way should the information provided by Opt to Thrive be considered medical advice, and at all times the advice of a medical professional should supersede recommendations from Opt to Thrive. If you have or suspect you may have a health problem, you should consult your healthcare provider. The views expressed in this podcast are purely that of Dr. Sims and do not in any way reflect those of the institution she contracts for medical services to.
Thank you for listening to Opt to Thrive. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate and share the podcast. You can visit our website at opttothrive.com and leave a comment for any subjects you would like to hear more about.